Welcome to Uncle Ruby's Storytime Fun, Episode 2, John Lennon. Tales from the Hinterland of Mind and Memory, hosted by Jamu and narrated by me, Uncle Ruby. Enjoy. The day John Lennon died, I was an 11-year-old grade 6 student who loved the Beatles, and my favorite album in the world was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. My parents, born in 1943 and 44 respectively, had somehow missed the 60s pop culture revolution. This meant that my love and pursuit of the Beatles and their music was my own personal journey, fueled by my own inner fire. My mother was so disconnected from the mainstream culture of her generation that in 1973, at 29 years of age, she was buying Jim Nabors albums instead of albums like Dark Side of the Moon. My father's rather modest album collection consisted of a few cowboy ballad compilations by singers like Tex Ritter and some Western movie and TV show theme soundtracks that he'd acquired in his youth. And the only substantive thing I can remember my mother telling me about the Beatles was how she got sick of hearing Obla-Dee Obla-Da after her customers played it incessantly at a diner she once worked at. Yet despite being raised in this musical and cultural wasteland, I had inexplicably received a Sgt. Pepper's cassette in my Christmas stocking in 1975 when I was 6 years old. And the magic of that album, those sounds and compositions imprinted on me as I played it over and over throughout the holidays, until it got unceremoniously chewed up by whatever crappy cassette player I had at the time, and was lost to me. I wouldn't get another copy until I was around 9 when I bought the new Capitol Records vinyl reissue. But the power and influence I experienced from those uninterrupted days of continuous play in 1975 meant that Sgt. Pepper was foundational in the creation of musical nodes in my developing brain and psyche. As a young boy, I did 3 things incessantly. I played records and cassettes, read, and listened to the radio. I had a small collection of albums at that point, a couple of dollar bin 50s rock compilations from Kmart, Elvis's Sun Sessions, and my vinyl copy of Sgt. Pepper's, which had been joined by the Red and Blue albums. And my evenings were spent alone in my room, reading and listening to those albums or the radio until the wee small hours. And it was on one of those evenings, December 8th, 1980, of late-night reading and listening alone in my room, that the news of John Lennon's shooting and eventually reported death broke live. The news, as the details trickled out, and then the near-continuous coverage of the world reacting to that news, had me transfixed. This was before the 24-hour news cycle, and in many ways it served as the prototype for how future news events of the same ilk would be covered. The template for coverage was being invented in real time, and the drama of how it was covered, its own metacultural narrative, became as much of the story as the events and details of the shooting itself. I remember running downstairs to tell my mother. My father, early to rise, was already in bed, and she, like me, was a night person. And she responded to the news with polite concern. It wasn't indifference. She said it was sad, but for her it was just another piece of information. I returned to my room and continued listening all night to the live coverage on the radio. They described the spontaneous spilling into the streets of New York by fans, and the impromptu vigils in the park and in front of the Dakota. And they played audio of interviews with fans and their reactions, the singing, the sobbing, and the cries of disbelief and anguish, the spontaneous eruptions of grief. It went on and on. That morning I awoke. My father had already left for work and my mother was still asleep. So I readied myself alone, eating my cereal and showering before dressing, heading off to deliver my morning papers, then to school. I attended a special program, French immersion, which meant that my school was unusually far from my home, so I left early, the walk about 45 minutes. The walk itself had a strangeness to it. I had adult things that I needed to talk about. I needed to commune with somebody about what I'd heard and experienced. But there was no one. The streets were empty. I walked alone in silence. I still remember the weather. It was cold and dull, overcast but very dry. And as I rounded the corner approaching the school, it too seemed empty and barren. There was one kid, a boy, probably 8 or 9 years old, playing alone on the outdoor rings, suspended in space by his arms. Or it might have been a girl. I called out, "John Lennon, did you hear?" The person just stared at me, hanging over the ground. I looked back at them and wondered, is anyone even there? In the parking lot of the school, I saw a teacher pulling some stuff out of her car. I approached. "John Lennon's dead. Somebody shot him." She turned and looked at me like I was an alien. Why is this child saying these things? She hadn't heard, and it was obvious that she didn't believe or she didn't want to believe. This wasn't how you were supposed to be told about these kinds of things by a child in a parking lot. She quickly left, dashing to the teacher's lounge, no doubt to get the news confirmed, and I was alone again. It wasn't until I saw my friend Vartan, he liked the Beatles too, though he was more of a Yellow Submarine guy, that I had a peer to share my experience with. But we were children. What could we really say? Our conversation centered around John's family. We expressed sadness for John and his wife, and especially his young son. And we seized on the idea that he would never be 64. We just didn't have the words. It wasn't until later that afternoon at home watching TV that I got to see the visuals of what I'd heard on the radio. The outpouring of grief in the crowds and the spirit of celebration and commiseration that had continued throughout the day. My parents were there then, watching with me, commenting. They were taken by the crowds and the sheer spectacle of it all. Look at all those people. John Lennon may have been the voice of their generation. He just wasn't their voice. Did they wonder at their own outsideness? Could they not see what this was doing to me? I could feel my mind and body changing through the experience as I watched the drama unfold, building new neural pathways and nodes in which to conceive of and store the experience. And I think I became an adult that day, breaking through the amniotic sac of adolescence to be new baptized by the world's tears for John. I now carried the burden of knowledge and knowing. That 1980 Christmas is one I'll never forget either. Double Fantasy and that famed image of John and Yoko kissing on the album cover, and the one on the back jacket of them standing in the street, casting their gaze towards an uncertain future. Those were the visuals of the season, and around the tree that morning, opening presents containing now long-forgotten toys, there was one present that was obviously an album addressed to me from my 80-year-old paternal grandfather. Now at 80, he was already half senile, and long beyond what I had assumed was the ability to absorb new information about the world. His mind, like his stories, seemed permanently resident in the past. I can remember peeling away the wrapping and seeing right away that it was Double Fantasy. Now I'd assumed my parents must have purchased it for him, and that maybe this was an acknowledgement of their understanding. I smiled at them, then looked over to my grandfather to give him the obligatory thank you as he watched me reveal the contents to the room. He gestured, calling me over for what I assumed was a Christmas hug. Yet as I leaned in towards him, he grasped me by the arm and pulled me in closer, whispering into my ear a single line. He was the best. I pulled back almost in shock while he held me firm and looked into my eyes. His eyes confirmed it. He was the best, he said again. I couldn't believe it. He knew. He knew. I still have that album, and back then I played it endlessly, building an elaborate narrative and mythology about John and Yoko and young Sean in my mind. And in this way, John's story was, as the album said of itself, a heart play. It was a story of love, for family, his lover, his young son, and a story of his pursuit of redemption in the world and the promise of the future. And my act of remembering, my own act of fantasy, was how I kept him alive. And today, almost 45 years later, as I reach into the caverns of my mind's construct, I can still find that place where John lives. Places where all the people I've lost still live. My grandfather, my father, and now, my mother. And I cherish and dwell in the memory, while I acknowledge the nagging sting of the loss.